Hello, everybody. It's time for a new GYN Garage. My name's Ed Pavlik. I'm in Lexington, Kentucky, where the blooms are coming out. My colleague today is,
Frank Lawton from London in the United Kingdom, and we are getting spring as well. The cherry trees are beginning to blossom, and the crocuses are out, and the daffodils. The nights are getting shorter, and the days are getting warmer, and it's it's a very good time of year.
well, Frank, I just read something today that U.S. health insurers, which are paid by state and the federal government to cover low-income Medicaid recipients, were paid twice and collected at least 4.3 billion over 3 years for patients who were enrolled and paid for in other states. This was reported in the Wall Street Journal. Could that happen in London? I mean, could someone live in London, have homes in Greater London and also in Surrey, and the health service would be paying for both of those? What do you think?
Well, that's not quite the same way that it works. You pay your national insurance and you are allowed universal health care wherever you turn up. So if you happen to become ill in Edinburgh, but you were resident in Bath, that wouldn't really matter. So it's they're not reimbursed in the same way that would be in the States. You have universal health care, and in theory, it's available wherever you are at any time. Um, but it's very interesting that you should mention that, because what is happening with social services in the UK is that previous governments have decided that there are certain criteria which, if you fulfill, then you will receive income benefit and supplements, and you will get support and things like that. And clearly, people who are very clever have just made up. There are boxes to tick, so they will go and find the symptoms that they are that allow you to gain all of this universal credit, and go to the local universal credit office and say, I've got all these symptoms, and they're immediately signed off and given sometimes more money than the minimum wage. So it's actually better to be unable to work than it is to look for work in the UK at the moment, which seems something that's, yeah, you can't, we can't keep doing that. We're going to run out of money.
Well, okay. Well, let's get back to Gynec Garage and this paper for today. It's going to consider a question that's pretty straightforward. Is there a relationship between depression and the risk of ovarian cancer? Answers to this question are approached in a paper called Timing of Depression in Relationship to the Risk of Ovarian Cancer, that was published in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute. Frank, why don't you take off from here? What do you think?
Okay. The group that's published these data also published a preliminary paper in 2015, which was in Gynecological Oncology. And they looked essentially at depression or symptoms of depression 2 to 4 years before a diagnosis of ovarian cancer. They came to the conclusion that the hazard ratio of 1.3, if you showed signs of depression, gave you a moderate increase in the risk of ovarian cancer. Although interestingly, if you weren't depressed, the hazard ratio was 1.34. So they just said there's a moderate link. However, this has not stopped them analysing the same data from the NHS studies, the nursing studies, which have really been going on since, I think, probably the mid-70s. And there must be a huge amount of data. They've followed up these nurses for 20, 30 years, and have looked at lots and lots of factors that may be involved in subsequent ill health, one of which is ovarian cancer. So what they've done is said, is the duration of your depressive illness a factor in the development of ovarian cancer? Not whether you just had it or not, but how long you've had it for. And they chose to look back over 10 years before a what they've called is, I think, is an ascertainment period, which I think is when the diagnosis of ovarian cancer was made. And they've looked back, or questionnaires of the 10 years previously, asking these patients about whether or not they've had diagnosed depression by a physician, diagnosed depression because they're antidepressants, or diagnosed depression because they've said they have been depressed. The reason why I think the authors chose 10 years is that they want obviously to be able to say there is a pre-malignant ovarian lesion, which, if influenced by depression, goes on, progresses to an invasive cancer. And obviously, if you were dealing with something like cervical intraepithelial neoplasia, there is a pre-malignant condition. And although it would be not appropriate no longer not to treat CIN, you could actually say CIN is what we're measuring, and then we'll have a look at what's the influence and see what happens to the cases of cervical cancer. They've chosen 10 years to follow up because of data that suggests that the pre-malignant or the precursor of invading ovarian cancer is fallopian tube fimbrial intraepithelial cancer, STIC. And they present some data that suggests from experimental models and mouse models that the time between the development of STIC and the development of invasive cancer is anywhere between 7 and 8 years. So they've gone back 10 years hoping to be able to determine this. Their results for this study are very similar actually to the study that I mentioned originally, that they say that if you've had a diagnosis of depression 10 years before you develop, or 10 years prior, you have a 30% greater chance of developing ovarian cancer. The hazard ratio is exactly the same as the previous paper, 1.3, when, as I said, they said this is a moderately increased risk. So I don't think they've found anything great in the fact that they've now looked at the length of treatment that you're on, or the length of time you've had depression, rather than just whether or not you're depressed. The interesting data, I think, is the table that you were showing, that it seems to be that the only one, the durations of any real significance, or if you've been diagnosed with depression between 0 and 2 years before the diagnosis, 6 to 8 and 8 to 10 years, but they don't. The statistics don't suggest that there's any increased risk between 2 and 4 and 4 and 6. And the paper doesn't actually explain why. If you're only depressed for a couple of years, it seems to have, it has a statistical significance. And if you're depressed for longer than that, the statistical significance is not quite as great. And you'd imagine, there's the table, thank you, Ed. You'd imagine that the longer you are depressed, the more the influence of the depression has on the ovarian cancer, but that does not seem to be the case. And this table shows that. The only one of real significance is the 0 to 2 years, both of which have a p-value of less than 0.01. And the paper doesn't explain why that discrepancy is there. I think there are a lot of criticisms, again, with the paper. The first thing, of course, is it's self-reporting. Now, people can say, yes, I was depressed for lots of reasons. They may not feel very well, and they consider that that's depression. The study also says, well, what if a clinician has said you have depression, and they've used a score to determine whether or not that's the case? And finally, whether or not you're on antidepressants. The problem, of course, is that not everybody who's on an antidepressant is depressed. Antidepressant treatment is used for other conditions. So just to say you're on an antidepressant doesn't necessarily mean you are depressed. So I think that's one of the problems. I think the natural history of ovarian cancer is not known. If STIC really is the precursor, then I think some more data needs to be found to determine this. And something else that's quite interesting, that the incidence of depression, and it's again in one of the tables, in their first study, they said the probable depression percentage was 11%. In the second study, 1989 onwards, it's 24%. So it's the incidence of their definition of depression has doubled. And I'm sure the incidence of ovarian cancer hasn't doubled in that time. There's something wrong with these statistics that I think that concerns me. And I think the other thing, that there's a group of patients that in the two studies diagnosed with probable depression. It's 28,000, nearly 28,000 patients. These are the ones I should be concentrating on. If you've got probable depression and you're being treated, does it make it a difference to the hazard ratio or the incidence of ovarian cancer? And I would have thought the 28,000 patients, if you follow them, they should be able to find that. That, of course, is going to be the subject of another paper. The NHS studies give and give. There are so much data. You could think of almost any influence, and they'd probably be able to produce a paper saying yes or no, it influences. There seems to be a link with stress. People who are stressed, who've undergone surgery, wound healing is less good. The milieu, or what they call the microtube milieu, with the change in T cells and B cells, stress does seem to affect all those. But whether or not this paper, I mean, what they say is stress is, or depression is treatable. Therefore, it's an important paper because you might be able to treat depression. I think they've got to prove that in the next paper.
Yeah, I agree, Frank, and I don't know. I sort of in my mindset, I'm reflexively turning to ovarian cancer as a faster growing disease than is depicted by the schema that's up in front right now. And in particular, we could be wrong because we know very little about the precursor lesion, but certainly I think invasion occurs much quicker than a 2-year period, and further metastasis. So what I'm really saying is that I think the time that passes between stage 1 and stage 3 is probably shorter than 4 years, which is sort of the way
Oh, yeah.
this thing depicts things. And also I'm caught with the fact that what we're seeing in that very schematic is that it would be possible for a person who really records his depression here between years 8 and 10 also records it between 0 and 4. May not be depressed during the interval 6 to 8 years, and whatever. And the question boils down to, how do you handle this person? Do you count them multiple times? Do you count them only once? Do you put them at the longest interval? Do you put them in the middle? Do you put them at the short time? Depression may or may not be continuous. So that's one consideration I have in sort of the experimental model. At best, only association is being shown here. And as they move forward, they may decide to only show association rather than moving into trying to determine causation. I think I wonder why people who are treated for depression still were included as problematic, a risk for ovarian cancer. The other thing that's clear to me too is that nurses are a stressed population. They work hard. They're faced with challenges in their work between very sick people, very demanding people, and many of the things that they have to deal with are extremely unpleasant, leading to stress. The relationship between stress and depression, exists, and I wonder if we're not dealing with by dealing with the readiness of these two nursing studies, if we're dealing with the readiness of an elevated stress population that would lead to the 30% risk factor much more readily than the general population. That's just the way I think about things. I think in the long run, there's a thing called shipping fever, so that if you catch a wild animal and are about to ship it to a zoo, you need to make that transit pretty quick, because if it's prolonged, the stress will cause the immune system to fail in that animal, and they'll die of whatever indolent infections they have, either bacterially or parasites or something like that. It's clear that corticosteroids allow stress to be solved, but at the same time they do it at the expense of depressing the immune system. And so I wonder if there's a play there, which they don't really mention. They mention it in terms of epinephrine, but don't mention the interplay with regard to corticosteroids in people or creatures who are stressed. Well, that's really all I have to say. It is interesting, and overall, I guess I would have to say it applies to a sort of a call at home plate. whether you think 30% increase in risk is moderate or big. I mean, some people can lean one way or lean the other way. But my question is it real? That's my take on things.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they talk about a 30% increase. If ovarian cancer, I don't know, one in 80, one in 70 something, 1.5%, 30% increase and 1.5% is not a lot. It's not going to affect if a woman is diagnosed with depression, I don't think that her clinician should say, oh, and the risk of you developing ovarian cancer is so great. I don't think these data show that. I agree there's a link, but obviously, the other thing that they do mention is that depression is commoner in females. Now, is it commoner in females for some biological reason, or is it because females are more susceptible to stress, just because of that's the way we've developed over the millennia? So I agree entirely. I think it's an interesting paper, but I think it's there's a lot more to do if we're really going to think that stress and depression are causative in ovarian cancer. And yeah, it's terribly cool and groovy to be diagnosed with stress and depression because it gets you off work, and people look to do. This is self-reporting. I feel stressed. So I fill in a questionnaire that comes to me every 2 years. Do you feel stressed? Well, I could do because the dog was run over yesterday, or the car broke down, or the holiday was cancelled because Heathrow fell apart. So I could be stressed for a short period of time, and I'm not so sure. So I tick the box. Yes, I'm stressed, but I'm not so sure that that's next time it happens. But that's what happens when you do, you have self-reporting data that you're relying on the people that you are. And the hope is, of course, that nurses know what they're doing. But as you've just said, they're going to be extremely stressed by the work that they do, and their stress may be very, very different. It's difficult to measure stress. There aren't degrees of stress. There certainly aren't degrees of stress in this paper. You're either stressed or depressed, or you're not. And the subtle nuances, the shades of it, I think, are missed completely by this.
Sure, and one thing too, which the authors mentioned, to be fair to them, is that the onset of ovarian cancer may be preceded by symptoms, and
Yeah,
the degree to which the symptoms are disturbing to the person and cause the depression is a real possibility. Now
yes,
they do mention that, so
yes, they
and that
do.
would
Yeah.
account for their highest findings in the 2-year interval
Mm,
for diagnosis.
yeah, yeah. Yes, they do. Yes, I accept that they do say that may be the reason, but what's the reason for the other 8 years where it's far less significant than that? Although, but I mean, I think your hypothesis that ovarian cancer is not as indolent as we think it is. I think going back 10 years is probably wrong. I reckon 3 or 4 years from the precursor lesion. That is probably the time we should be looking at depression and stress rather than going back over 10 years, because I suspect that if you asked almost anybody in the population over 10 years and gave them some symptoms of stress, they would say, yeah, I've had that. Yeah, yeah, I agree. You sow them with the idea that they're being stressed, and they'll probably, we all would. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I think it's you give people some idea of symptoms, and they'll say, yeah, I've had that a few times.
That's right. Well, we've finished this paper, and I want to do it again, and we'll do it in another time next month.
Oh, sounds good to me.
Okay, Frank.
Okay,
It was
see you then.
good being with you today.
Bye bye now. Bye bye.